back to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm Shannon Rogers, your host, and happy holidays. We're going to make some reindeer. This is something that I've seen done in 100 videos online, usually for an advertisement for something like the Carter stabilizer to make really, really tight and fast curve cuts. But I've never seen anybody attempt this doing it entirely by hand. It's probably because it's a stupid idea, but I'm going to find out. The pattern for this really can be found anywhere online. If you were to Google bandsaw reindeer, do an image search, you're going to find hundreds of images in different styles, contemporary, more classical designs. This I actually got from the Wood Gear site, and I was able to print something out and basically create a pattern with it by just using carbon paper, transfer it onto some plywood, and cutting it out. And that's where I want to start. So once you transfer the pattern, you want to cut it out of this 1/8" plywood. And this is a really great opportunity to just kind of warm up your fret sawing. This is obviously a lot more delicate than the actual stock is going to be in working with really, really thin pieces. So I've actually got my fret saw set up with a really fine blade. This is a 28 teeth per inch blade, perfect for fret sawing and marquetry type work. And what it does will leave me with a really, really clean cut so that, frankly, I don't have to do any cleanup on this. And this will be a nice pattern that I can reuse time and time again. So for doing this work by hand, I have what's known as a bird's mouth fixture. This is something I made years ago in the hand tool school, and it continually gets used in my shop. I set it in my leg vise. It sets it up about shoulder height for me, makes it, I can get real close to the work and see what I'm doing. The bird's mouth is this angled cutout in the front here, and I've drilled a hole to allow me to do real close work. I can work right in the hole, or I can work in the bird's mouth. And what it does is it allows constant support of the stock as you're sawing through it. And more often than not, you're focusing on turning the stock and not turning the saw. Reality is I end up doing a little bit of both. But the beauty of it is when I come in and I saw, I've got the blade set up to cut on the pull stroke. And gravity helps keep the saw cut vertical. And you really don't even have to think about getting a nice plumb cut because you're working with gravity like that. So let me go ahead and cut out this piece. Obviously, I've already cut this one out. This is the least difficult, I think, of the profiles. Let's get cutting here. One of the things I'm always focusing on, other than blowing the dust off, is making full-length strokes of the saw, using the whole blade, but also working in a very controlled manner. Good, consistent rhythm. A lot of times when you get into kind of detailed cuts, you want to kind of nibble like this, and that will work, and sometimes that's a good technique around tight curves. But it will translate to the work. Long, consistent rhythm cuts like this yield a much cleaner cut. And you'll find that the saw responds and performs much better in a consistent rhythm. So I've got my first tight curve. I'm going to focus on turning the wood, and you can see I increase the frequency of the cut, or the stroke rather, as I come around that corner. The thing you always want to be doing when you're turning is cutting. If I try to turn and then cut, the saw is going to bind. So in order for it to flow smoothly around the curve, I'm going to make sure that I'm on the cutting stroke. Okay, we're into basically an inside corner. So what I'm going to do is just kind of turn in place. And you can see how easily that turns while I'm cutting. Because I've got this, what do they call this, a 2-watt, 28 TPI blade, it really turns on a pinpoint. Okay, here's another sharp turn. I'm going to take some shorter strokes here. And then I'm going to go back to long strokes.
For the rest of this pattern, just relax and focus on your skills. Focus on keeping constant saw strokes. Focus on increasing the frequency of the stroke as you round those corners and sticking right to your line. This is practice for getting ready for actually sawing at the piece. The much thicker stock that follows will test these skills. This 1/8" plywood is a piece of cake compared to what's coming. So this is a great opportunity to warm things up. Look at it this way. If you move on to something like marquetry or other fretwork on more complicated projects, this is where you're going to draw on the skills that you practice right now on something simple like a pattern.
And if you really wanted to cut fast, you could angle it forward a little bit. This is the same principle of an orbital jigsaw blade. And ta-da! So all that's left for me to do now is just cut out the feet. So before I tackle this piece, I need to kind of figure out my order of cuts. And this thickness here is pretty substantial. So cutting this profile is really going to be murder. Anything I can do to remove some of that wood is going to be nice. So these inner parts, I can cut them out and they won't affect anything else. As I cut this profile, that's going to affect my ability to flip it down on its side and cut this out. So I want to make these side cuts in one pass so that I can tape the offcut back on, flip it down, and have a nice flat surface to reference off of. But these internal cuts between the antlers and between the legs, they won't affect anything when I flip that down. But I'm also cutting across the full thickness here. So again, the internal cuts on this side, I can cut this out and it won't affect how this registers, and it's going to remove a great deal of waste from this particular cut. And with the thickness comes the need for beefier saws. I'm going to use a coping saw for this one. First thing I want to do is establish a line that's square down the face. And again, just trust gravity on this bird's mouth. Let it pull the saw straight down for you. Tried it with the coping saw a little bit. I'm going to switch over to a turning saw, a little bit more aggressive blade. This is a 10 points per inch blade. It's going to cut through this much faster, and I've got a 12-inch long blade, so I can get that 12-inch long stroke. But I've got a wider blade, so it won't turn. It's not quite as agile, which means I need to anticipate my turns. Start making them well in advance of when they actually happen. Or, a nice compromise to that is a turning saw with a finer pitched blade. This is a 22 points per inch blade. With it is a slightly narrower blade, but a somewhat more delicate tooth line actually gives me more control and ability to turn with more agility. I think I'm going to back out of that and come in from the other side now. These turning saws require a lot more anticipation of the curve. That wider blade requires a little bit more room to make a turn. That doesn't necessarily mean it won't turn as tight a corner, but because it's leaving a wider curve, it does mean that you got to give it a little bit slower time to make that turn. So you can see, I pretty much have nailed that line. There's a couple little spots of marker I can see, but even with that wider blade, I was able to hit that. Trying a couple different blades, getting a feel for a couple of different saws. Really, really great exercise here. I think I'll turn my attention to the spot in between the antlers, and based on the success I just had, I'm going to keep with my turning saw with the 22 points per inch blade. Let me establish the plumb line down the end grain first. And this is a little bit like cutting a tenon. I lean the saw forward a little bit so that I'm cutting more into the wood on the top, and just let gravity again draw the bottom part of the blade in to create a straight line right down the end grain. So I'm just barely scratching the surface down here at the bottom, and I'm in about 1/8 of an inch at the top. Again, smooth strokes. And I'm going to start anticipating that curve at the bottom already. And when I come into those curves, it's especially imperative that I make sure my saw is straight up and down. If it's tilted back at all, which I do tend to do on a straighter cut because it's a little bit quicker, but if I start coming through that curve and the saw is tilted, I'm going to get this weird compound curve. It also is going to affect its ability to make that turn because I'm presenting a wider beam here. So what I really want to do is make sure I'm straight up and down. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make this. I can feel the blade wanting to bind on me. I've almost made that turn. Now, you can hear it really wanting to bind, and it starts to make this little ting, 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 ting noise as it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. That's the precursor to a broken blade. So I pretty much made that turn, so now the rest of this will be real easy to get to. gravity set my plumb cut. And there again, I'm in about 1/8 inch on the top and just have nicked the bottom. I'm going to lean the saw forward a little bit now, because that's what's most aggressive. Start anticipating that curve. Obviously, the thicker the wood you're sawing through, the more you have to anticipate too. Okay, let's really get this all straight up and down here. There we go. There we go. That's through. There we go. It's quite a little puzzle piece. All right. Now the bottom part's cut out. So now I'm going to move on to the side profile cut. The odd thing here is that even though I'm working in this much thicker stock, it actually works better to use a finer pitch saw. The finer pitch saw certainly will have a narrow blade allowing me to make these turns, but also it glides over the wood a little bit more. So while in essence it might be a little bit slower to make these cuts, I'm getting consistency throughout. A heavier pitch saw will want to grab at the wood a little bit more, and with such a thick block to saw through, it could throw things around a lot more and make the cutting kind of stutter stop a lot. Okay, got both sides cut out, and I've gone ahead and taped the offcuts back into place. So now I'm ready to move on to the side profile. And frankly, this is going to be so much easier because of the thickness of the stock that I'm dealing with now. Nope, I don't think I can make that. So now I will go to my fret saw. And here's another surprise. Look how quickly this is cutting for the size of the saw and the pitch of the teeth. Again, it goes to show you that you can't really make assumptions on coarseness of teeth or length of the saw blade. It's obvious that with this tiny saw blade comes a smaller kerf, just less resistance in the wood. And this fret saw is frankly doing what it's meant to do, cutting really detailed fretwork. So now let me flip this up and let's look at these cuts. You can see where I started with the coping saw, really quite rough, and then here's my more aggressive turning saw blade. Here's where I get to the fine turning saw blade, and then I come into this really smooth cut here, and that's the fret saw blade. So there's certainly some merit to using that fret saw as far as the work that I may have to clean up later. Here on this really curvy path to the antlers, you can see where the bird's mouth comes in really handy, allowing me to rotate the work and not the saw. So I can just kind of establish a almost mechanical rhythm, just moving the saw straight up and down, and not, worrying about altering my stroke or changing my body position. Again, focusing on making my moves while the saw is cutting. One a little wide there. All right, we're out of the woods there on the antlers. The rest of this part is pretty straightforward, maybe a little tricky inside curve here, but nothing compared to what we just went through with the antlers. that's it. So let's remove the jigsaw here. Pull away all the excess. And there is our reindeer. Of course, you also can take this exercise one step further and grab a rasp and start to clean up all of these surfaces. I kind of like the Sawn look, but you know, there's a couple of rough spots here and there, maybe some of the edges I want to break, but I can also learn a lot about how my rasp and files work too. Whatever you do, you're probably going to end up having to make a herd of these things. You're going to get really good at the techniques we discussed. So I hope you guys enjoy this, give it a shot, and happy holidays.
So this is a project that I have always seen done with power tools, and I think I can understand why. In the hand tool world, a project like this is what we call a learning experience. It's something that's probably better done more efficiently with a power tool, but since we're going with hand tools, we're going to stick it out and learn something. And I learned a lot about how my frame saws work, from cutting out the patterns to cutting out the actual reindeer. You never know what you might learn and how you might challenge yourself with a relatively simple project like this reindeer.